All right, I'm back. It's been a bit of a hiatus from the channel here, but I decided to come back and make some videos. Obviously, this is a bit different than what I've been doing with, like, let's say the Montero or the Jeep or anything else that you might have seen already. But yeah, I decided to make some videos about modifying these 24 scale crawlers. I started getting into these things during COVID, and it kind of took off. And this little truck in particular is one that I don't see a lot of attention given to. So I decided, hey, let's show people what they could possibly do with this thing. This truck is not popular, and it's not popular for good reason. This is the Element Enduro24. Very similar, if not identical, to the RGT V2 crawler, the one that looks like the Land Rover. Yeah. I actually got one of those during COVID when I couldn't get an SCX24. And that's what kind of started this whole thing. But I figured let's take a dive into this thing, see what we can do. What we're going to focus on right now is actually just what can be done for cheap or free if you just have one of these lying around. I know a lot of guys, a lot of people picked these things up just because it was cheap, and maybe they couldn't get something else like me, or maybe it was a gift. Maybe somebody gave it to them because they didn't like it. They do have potential. It's just you kind of have to work with them to get them to be worth anything. So I'm kind of going to do this in stages. We're going to start with essentially free or cheap modifications, and then kind of step up throughout putting this thing together to make it, you know, a competitive little truck. So first things first, let's talk about why it's not good, or why it falls short from its competition, like the SCX24. Okay, number one, SCX24 has an insane aftermarket because it's an axial product. An axial, you know, is axial. This thing here is not a true Element product. It's made by someone else, and hence the reason it's the same as the RGT and others. And so because it's made by somebody else, you know, there's the manufacturer's not going to put that much effort into things. Okay. A couple other major issues with it right out of the box is tire height. Okay, so the stock tire is extremely small. Let me see if I can grab a stock axial tire. So here is a stock Jeep JL axial tire. Okay, that's a massive difference. So right out the gate, you're at a disadvantage because the diameter of the tire is small, which means it falls into cracks, which means it's harder to get up obstacles, etc., etc. The compound itself is pretty good. I actually think if this tire was a larger diameter, it would be really good. It doesn't have any foams. It's glued. There's no bead lock. It's got that like TSL pattern, and it's actually a really nice tire. It's just tiny. It's so small. So that's a big problem. Okay. Another big problem with these is that the axles have a massive differential because it's ring and pinion. So they hang down, and if you couple the fact that there's a lot of low-hanging fruit with the smaller diameter tire, you're asking for issues. Okay, so that's another problem. Okay, one of the other issues is this comes from the box, out of the box, as a 1S setup, so really underpowered. The drive shafts on it are pretty weak. All right, they're pretty cheap plastic. I mean, you can see just from this thing has never been run ever. I've never hooked the battery up, but it's pretty weak. It's pretty flimsy. Okay, so yeah, that stinks. Other things, when you try to climb something, the back end hits because it has a lot of overhang here. All right, so if you were to look at it like this, you know, you're talking about a decent chunk hanging off the back end of this. The front, much better, but still not good. Okay, I actually think that can be improved upon. So let's take this out here and we'll take a look at some other stuff. Okay, so a couple other things that are unfortunate. The battery's in the back. All right, when you're climbing, which most of these things are going to be doing, climbing, you want weight up front, or at least middle. You want the center of gravity to be as low as possible, so it's less likely to roll over or flip back. So having that back there, even though it's a small battery, it's not a good thing. If you put this thing on 2S or you upgrade it to a 2S system, you don't want the battery in the back. Okay. The control arms, the suspension, everything themselves, they're pretty short. They only have joints on the axle ends here, okay? Which isn't really hindering. You know, I'm getting full travel of the shock there. Well, at least in the back. But it kind of stinks that it is the way it is. Speaking of suspension travel, in the front end, well, let's take a look here. If I compress the back end like this, it goes all the way up. That's full shock compression, okay? If I do the front, it stops. You see how much, so much less. Look at the back, how much travel that is. Look at the front, far, far, far less. And it's because when the front end compresses, it hits that servo horn. Top of the differential hits the servo horn, okay? So that's a problem, okay? So a couple things that we're gonna do right out the gate. We're gonna raise the servo so we get full travel of the shock, okay? We're going to mid-mount the battery and electronics, or at least get them closer to the middle, okay? We're going to get rid of this stinger. We're gonna cut it off, smooth it out. That way, when we get up to an obstacle, it's not hindering us. If you're at an obstacle where, let's say the rock was, you know, a quarter of an inch ahead of you and you needed to climb up something, you're not going to because you're hitting, okay? So we're gonna get rid of that. The other thing we're gonna do right out of the gate is we're going to do a mild comp cut on the back of this thing. We're probably gonna take it off about there, maybe the whole bumper all the way across, maybe at an angle. I don't really know yet, but we're gonna trim it up. That way, if we get up on an incline, we don't have any issues, okay? So, that being said, let's get started. So what we're gonna do, we're gonna reach in here, we're gonna unscrew the 2 screws that hold the servo on. Another downside to this, or at least one that people tend to complain about, is that the screws are all Phillips head screws, which also means they're not like a standard M1 like is on the axial. So it's like an actual screw, like a, I don't even know what the terminology is, but it's a screw, not like a machine screw with a nut. It's got a very coarse thread, which also means it's kind of hard to find hardware for, as weird as that is. So we're gonna reach in here with my pliers. I'm just gonna grab that screw because it's stuck in there and it disappeared into the abyss. I do not know where it went. Truthfully, where's that screw? Okay, so where'd it go? So we got the screws out of this, okay? And what I'm gonna show you is, if you see there how the servo is sitting on its mount, okay, when I push up on the axle till it contacts, see how much higher that went? See that gap between the servo ear and the mount? That's how much of a spacer we need to make this thing compress the whole way, okay? So you need it on the front and the back. Now that can be done in a couple different ways. You can just do washers, little washers, that's fine. You could take some polystyrene sheet and cut out some stuff, drill some holes and have little spacers. You could do all kinds of stuff. You could do lock nuts that are maybe, or any kind of nut that's a larger, slightly larger diameter than the screw, so it just acts as a spacer. I happen to have some little spacers left over from something, so that's what I'm going to use. But you could do all kinds of things to get this thing up, okay? So what we're trying to achieve by raising this is getting full suspension travel, right? Get it all the way up out of the way, at least to where that's not the thing that's contacting, because currently that's the thing that's contacting. The downside to this is you're going to raise the servo, which means the body might touch or might hit or might have to be raised even. But we're going to put these spacers on and then we'll kind of evaluate it and see what it looks like. So I got these little aluminum spacers here. I forget what they're actually from, but I'm going to use those. I did dig up some hardware that was a little bit longer just in one of my random hardware boxes. Let me see if I can get this here. There's a huge difference between what I had, which is this one, and what I'm putting in. One other trick that I've picked up, it's kind of not the right way, but if you need stuff, you work with what you got. These are number 2 brass wood screws, all right? They're a little bit larger than this in diameter, but they'll work. They won't work in this spacer, but they'll work for a lot of other things. So keep that in mind. Also, it's brass, so it weighs more, so that's neat. But having trouble finding the right screws to use is a hindrance. If you have an SCX24 or a little SCX24 hardware kit, you can use this, but they don't really grab correctly, and you end up having to put some shoe goo or some super glue or something in there, because these screws are machine thread, not coarse thread. Okay, so what we're gonna do is we're gonna put this thing in. I'm gonna use a little bit of shoe goo because I want to hold the spacer on the rear in place. It's really, really hard to get to. So I'm going to use a little bit of shoe goo just so it doesn't fall off while I'm putting it all together. Okay. There's that. There's this. Now the shoe goo stuck to my finger. So put this screw through here like so. Boom. This is silly. What am I doing? Let's cut these zip ties and give us some room here, some breathing room. There we go. So push the screw down through. Take my little spacer with my shoe goo to hold in place. Throw it up on there, and then drop that guy right back down where it was. Screw it in place. Boom. Okay, so the back one's on. So now you can see what the spacer is going to look like on there, sort of. So let's take the front spacer and a slightly longer screw. Let's put it in. All right, so the spacers are in. Got one in there in the front, so that's maybe a 1/4 inch lift. So now it goes that much further up. In fact, the servo is no longer hitting the differential, top of the differential. In fact, the upper links, upper control arms are hitting the bottom of the transmission there. So that's what's stopping us from moving any further. But you can see now that I have way more travel in the front. Still have the same in the rear, obviously, but way more in the front. So that's great. Okay, so now we have full range of motion. We don't want anything binding or hitting to be limiting the capability of this truck, because it's already very limited to begin with. So the next thing I'm going to do is trim off this stinger here. Okay, so that's real simple. Take some cutters and cut it. And wow, look at that. Performance. Woo! Take this sticker off while I'm at it, because that's ugly. So you can take some sandpaper or file and file that down. That's pretty close, and close enough for me. But now you'll see that when I come up against an obstacle, I mean, look how much closer I'm able to get to it. Way closer. Before I was back like this. So that's pretty cool. All right, so the next one's going to be a little bit more labor intensive. What we're going to do is we're going to take off the speed control and the battery, and we're going to take this plate that I cut out of styrene, and we're going to either tape it, glue it, screw it on top of the existing plate, and then we're going to move all of this stuff forward. So let me do all the hard work, and then I'll show you what I did. All right, so I took the ESC off, took the battery off. The battery just sits back here with a rubber band, and the ESC is double-sided tape to the stock bracket there. So I just did some double-sided tape myself. Just stick that guy on there. You will see here too that when you do that, that plate now will just sit right on top of that transfer case, okay? Which is pretty nice. It's not adhered to that at all. It still has space for that dog bone. And the dog bone doesn't move with the suspension because it's static, but it's all sitting right down there. And one of the big things is that all of this is completely reversible. We're not chopping up or modifying anything. It's all reversible up until a certain point. Currently, we're still reversible. So next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to put the ESC back on. I'm going to put it right back where it was because I don't need it to move. We got enough wire, so we're going to put it right back where it was. And then what we have now is we have this place for the battery to go up front. Okay, we can actually move the ESC forward if we wanted it to, but I'm going to leave it some space. If we decide to run a bigger battery, we'll have the space for that. We'll also have room to do different configurations if we want, and then figure out how we're going to fasten this. I may just use some Velcro for the time being, which would be fine. But yeah, we got tons of room there, and it actually lowered the battery just a little bit because the back end here sits higher than where the ESC is. So we may be at the same, we may be lowered a little bit, but now we're putting that weight, even though that battery's pretty light, we're putting that weight over the middle versus it being over the back end. So it should help us climb, should bring that center of gravity towards the center a little bit more. So I'm going to go ahead and tape this back on, get this all cleaned up with the wiring, and then get this battery put on with the Velcro. I realize it looks pretty ugly with the white, but with a body on there, you're not going to see it. And if you really wanted to, you could paint it before you put it on. But either way, it's going to be an improvement of what we had. So let's get to that. All right, so we got the ESC receiver combo set back on there, double-sided taped on. We got our wiring tied back up, and we got our battery put on with some Velcro. So I was actually able, with enough cable, to push the battery as far forward as possible, which is great. Sits exactly where I want it. Feels better, okay? I know that sounds crazy thinking about what we did, but it just feels better. Yeah. So far we've raised the servo to give us more suspension travel. We've trimmed off that stinger to give us a better approach angle. We moved the battery forward, got it out of the rear like that. And then the next thing we're going to do is slap the body back on, and we're going to trim this back bumper so that when we're climbing, it's not just dragging its tail, okay? I actually really like this little body, that like Sendero body. Looks like a Ford Ranger to me, which I think is pretty neat. He even has, you know, a little bit of a drop bed with those little wheel wells. I think it's pretty neat. So there we have it. I think it looks better too. It looks a little more sporty with that comp cut. And now, I mean, look how much more vertical that gets. That's way, way, way better. So, there are a couple other things as far as freebies that you can do. One of the things I noticed, and I actually tried it on a spare axle I had, is see these screws that hold the ends of the axle housing on? You can actually take this whole assembly off and flip it over. Like take this side off, flip it over, put it on this side, so the screws on the top. I know that doesn't seem like much, but if we're trying to smooth the bottom out and get rid of low-hanging fruit, that's how you can do it. And you can actually do the same thing with the front end too. I realize it's, like I said, it sounds silly, but you can actually take this entire knuckle assembly off because it has no camber built into it, and you can actually flip it over and flip it to the other side. I tried it on the other one and it worked. I'm not going to do it here because it's kind of a pain, but if you're really trying to get every ounce of performance out of this thing that you can without spending any money, that's one way to do it. So there's your freebies. There's a couple freebies you can do. The next thing that I would do is probably going to be tires and wheels. And I have tires and wheels here that I'm going to put on it. And I'll show you here kind of what we're dealing with. So I showed you already that this is a stock Jeep wheel from an SCX24. That's a huge difference. Unfortunately, these tires stink, and the rubber compound is bad, and I'm not going to use them. Here is a Proline Hyrax, comes mounted on a wheel, plastic wheel. I have not tried it, but I mean, even that tire, and this tire is considered a smaller tire. Even that tire is huge compared to these. And then, of course, here is like the RC four-wheel drive Mudslinger. Look, just, it's gargantuan compared to this. It's so big, but it would take a lot of cutting, so we're not going to do that. The other major downfall of this truck is that those ring and pinion gears are a 2-to-1 ratio, okay? So they're like airplane gears. They're very high. They're not for crawling. These trucks are pretty peppy on 2S, but the gearing in it is just atrocious. Just for comparison, stock SCX24 gearing is 8-to-1 reduction. This is 2-to-1 reduction. There is no comparison. In fact, on my RGT, one of the things I did was swap SCX24 axles into it, and it made a giant difference in its capability. People also ask me, like, well, why do you even like this platform? If you have to do all this work to it, why even bother? I really like the separate transmission transfer case, okay? I like the motor forward design. I actually like the chassis mounted servo. I think it gives it a better scale appearance. So I think that's pretty neat. But the gear reduction in the transmission to transfer case is pretty low. So when you put in SCX24 axles, it is extremely slow. And if you like slow crawl, and I mean really slow, it's great. But there is absolutely no high-end punch when you do that, okay? So there's got to be a middle ground between 8-to-1 and 2-to-1. What I was trying to get to is if we go to a larger diameter tire, although it gives us more clearance and better capability to climb and go through obstacles and have wheels not fall into cracks, it actually makes the truck faster and harder to slow crawl. So going to a larger tire is just a domino effect to what you're going to have to do afterwards, which is get the truck to go slower. So I'm going to wait. We'll do that some other time. One other thing to point out, a couple other things to point out with this, reasons I like it. The skid, it's pretty flat. SCX24 skids are not this flat. And I know that it has a drop there, right? But overall, that's a very smooth skid plate, and I think that's pretty awesome. I really like that. Like I said, I like the forward motor, the forward motor design. I like that. Be on the lookout for a video after this where we start hitting things a little bit harder with some more parts and really changing things up. I have plans for the whole build, so hopefully it'll be enjoyable, and at the end of it, we'll have something that's pretty capable. So thanks again. Little makeshift course here. It's got a pretty good dip here and a little climb. Just drops off the back, nothing major. But let's try this one-handed. One of the major downsides to this little truck is there is almost no slow crawl. Between the gearing and the ESC, it just really needs a lot of help. If I had a larger tire, this probably wouldn't be the scenario here. See if I can get out of that.